Thank you so much for joining us and for the very important, timely work that you do. I have read your book with a lot of interest and very much enjoyed your style of writing. I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about my background because it's the basis for the questions that I have for you today. So I'm an agroecologist, and my work focuses on transforming agriculture and food systems into ones that are more ecologically sound and socially just. In addition, I was born and raised in El Salvador, so most of my research and actions are with smallholder farmers in the developing world and the organizations that support them. So I bring a really strong perspective and concern for the global south in everything that I do. This also includes work on climate change. In the last decade, I have also had a stronger focus on issues of justice in agriculture and food systems, locally, nationally, and globally. So the way that I have organized the evening is to first discuss some questions with you, and then give you the opportunity to engage with the audience. And I hear we have quite a few people who have joined us tonight. So once again, thank you for joining us. My first set of questions is about the tone that your book has, which I found really compelling. Can you tell us more about the life experiences and some of your life journey that motivated the content of the book and also the tone that you brought to it?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you for having me. It's an honor to be in this lecture series. I wish I could be there instead of here. When I was watching those introductory videos in the beginning, I did have this eerie feeling of, is this really happening? You know, I guess part of that was influenced by them having been pre-recorded, but Zoom does create that uncanny sensation of both being there and not being there. And I hope we can find ways of this feeling real and intimate and productive in an interpersonal way rather than just in an intellectual way. So toward that end, I can situate myself just a little bit to make this slightly more personal. I'm in Brooklyn right now. I'm in my home. I am lit. In front of me is a window. I can even just show you what it looks like for the sake of it. It happens to be a beautiful day, and I know we're going to be talking about the climate and weather a bit. One unhappy side effect is my skin looks like Mike Pence's hair. I was just noticing that. So very pale. I need to get out more, probably. So I read a poll recently that more than half of American college students are feeling fear about climate change and feeling anger about climate change. I can't even imagine what it is like to be a student right now, trying to navigate this moment of climate crisis and this moment of social justice and this moment of COVID and this moment of our incredibly tragically fraught political system. I had it much, much easier when I was in college. That having been said, and this is my way of getting to your question, I've also felt a mixture of emotions. And I would say they've been ramping up over the last year, 4 years, 6 years, particularly when it comes to the climate crisis. And I have also felt some amount of fear, and I've also felt some amount of anger. I typically, or in the past, I addressed that fear outward, and I addressed that anger outward. I was afraid of systems, and I was angry at political leaders who weren't doing what we need them to do, angry at corporate leaders who are abusing the environment for personal gain. And about 2 years ago, and this is the genesis of the book and my choice to write the book in the way that I did, I found some of that fear and anger turning inward as I was witnessing a distance between the person that I thought I was and the person that I described myself as being, and the person I actually was in terms of the choices that I was making. I noticed at a certain point, and shamefully late in my story that despite having, like really well-crafted monologues I could deliver on the frustrations of climate deniers, my carbon footprint was almost certainly larger than that of most climate deniers. So I wanted to write a book not about some kind of enlightenment that I'd achieved, not even an argument to a reader about a certain way of being, a certain better way of being, but instead I wanted to share a struggle that I was experiencing, the struggle of being a person in this moment of climate crisis who, and we should say like the great majority of Americans, believes in the science of climate change, who, like the great majority of Americans, thinks that our government should be doing something about it and corporate leaders should be doing something about it, and yet feels lost or powerless, or at the very least alienated inside of this moment. So in my efforts to write a personal book about what it's like to try to navigate this moment, I decided not to pretend that I know as much about agriculture as you do, for example. I know a fraction of what you know about agriculture, and not to pretend that I was any kind of scientist or a journalist or even an advocate in any traditional sense. I decided to write a personal book which would allow in, and had to allow in, all of the things that were informing all of the identities that determine the choices that I make, whether it's the kinds of information that I'm exposed to, or the death of my grandmother, which occupies a large part of the book. So, on the one hand, that was a kind of a strategy, because climate change has been, I think, aptly described as one of the most boring subjects that has ever been introduced to humankind. It's a very hard subject to care about, for most people, to care about over time. It's easy to have strong feelings about in the moment, and it's very hard to care about over time. So in part it was a strategy to try to find a new way to tell a story that could engage people like me who have a hard time caring about the climate over time. But it was also honest. I was trying to reflect my own thought processes.
Yeah. I really appreciate that answer. And when I first came to the University of Vermont, I'm in the environmental program, and I used to teach the ENVS2, International Environmental Studies. And the students would be very frustrated with the topic of climate change because we couldn't it's really hard to get it to that personal space for people. So I can envision we might be using this video for some of our classes, because I think the way you expressed how you decided to make it personal will resonate with all of us. Both, all the learners who are learning about it, it is a hard one to grapple. I'll ask one more question about the personal note, because in our work we're doing a lot of intergenerational work with young farmers, and in your book you mentioned your grandparents quite a bit, and what motivated you to share a little bit of their life histories?
I should say that I've done that, I believe, in every book that I've written, whether they've been novels or nonfiction. I find it sort of impossible not to, which is itself a bit of a mystery to me, because I have found it actually very easy to, or I did find it easy, neither of them are alive anymore, I found it easy not to give them that much attention in life. I found them very easy, and I say this with embarrassment and with even some shame, I found it easy to ignore them. And yet in my writing I found it impossible to ignore them. It's one of the reasons I would so strongly encourage everybody watching this to write. Not necessarily to attempt to become a professional writer if that's not your interest, but one of the wonderful side effects of writing is you create a self-portrait which is sometimes at odds with how you think you look, or the person that you think you are. So one of the things that surprised me is the influence of my grandparents. It so happens that my grandmother was in the process of dying in the year that I wrote this book. And so when I made the decision not to pretend to be a journalist, not to pretend to be a scientist, and not to pretend to be an advocate, but instead to write about my own intimate struggles, once I made that choice, it then became impossible not to include the experience of witnessing her die, which included reflecting on her life and the choices that she made. My grandmother fled Eastern Europe before the Nazis entered her shtetl. She left behind, she was the only person to leave in her family. She left behind siblings, cousins, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, friends, all of whom were murdered. And so I take that as an occasion to think about, why is it that some people act on knowledge and other people don't? Because my grandmother didn't have any privileged access to knowledge. There was not something that she knew that the rest of them didn't know. But what she knew awakened something in her that motivated her to make an extraordinarily difficult decision, a far more difficult decision than the one that faces us with regard to climate change and the kind of changes we need to make in our lives. I have yet to hear a climate scientist say you have to leave your family in order to save the planet. In fact, and I'm sure we'll get to this in a minute, the things that we have to do, which are not ambiguous and not controversial, are relatively small, even if they're inconvenient or somewhat painful. So I looked to my grandmother, and I looked to my grandfather as well, who was able to survive in his own way, but then committed suicide not long after coming to the States. I looked at them at models of action and inaction, and models of a will to survive and not having the ability to muster that will.
Yeah, that part resonated with me a lot because I grew up in a civil war, and we made the decision to leave our country at some point. A lot of members of my family, and I think it's a really good transition to the next set of questions that are focusing on this notion of knowledge, belief, and evidence. And you mentioned your grandmother. Her decision was because she believed that something was going to happen. Something really bad is going to happen, and I'm going to take this incredibly hard choice. So in that first section of your book, you write that you would call the climate crisis a crisis of belief. And you write that there is a difference between knowing and believing, and that perhaps most importantly, this difference really affects a trigger in people taking action. Please tell us more about that.
So I tell a story in the book, a true story, and use it. It becomes the kind of sun around which a lot of these themes and other stories orbit, and I can share it. It's pretty brief. But I would encourage you all actually to, if you go to YouTube and search for Jan Karski, he's the hero of this story, Jan. His last name is Karski. You can hear him tell it, and he tells it much better than I do. But the short version of it is, in 1942, a 28-year-old Catholic who was in the Polish underground named Jan Karski embarked on a mission to travel from Nazi-occupied Poland to London and ultimately to the United States in order to inform world leaders of what was going on in Europe and to try to motivate them to act against the Germans. In preparation for his journey, he smuggled himself into the Warsaw Ghetto as well as into an extermination camp in order to collect evidence, to collect testimony so that he could present Western leaders with, an irrefutable case. And so he arrived in America in D.C. in June of 1943, and one of the first meetings he had was with Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, who's regarded as one of the most intelligent people America's ever produced, and who himself is Jewish, which is relevant for this story. So Frankfurter heard Karski out. He heard the testimonies, he heard the information, and he peppered him with questions like, how tall is the wall that separates the prisoners in the Warsaw Ghetto from the rest of the city? And then he paced the room in silence, thinking about trying to digest all that he just heard, and he sat down and he said, Mr. Karski, a man like me talking to a man like you, I have to be frank. And I have to tell you that I'm unable to believe what you just told me. And Karski's colleague, who was with him, pleaded with Frankfurter and said, how can you not believe what he's saying? Why on earth would he have gone to all of this trouble, manufactured all of this evidence, for what end, other than the end of truth? And Frankfurter said, I didn't say that this man is lying. I said that I'm unable to believe him. Mm-hmm. And then the next sentence he uttered, for me, is almost the thesis of my book. He said, my mind and my heart are made in such a way that I can't accept it. So Frankfurter, what's so interesting is he didn't question the truthfulness of what Karski was saying. He didn't dispute that the Germans were systematically murdering the Jews of Europe, his own relatives. And he didn't respond that while he was persuaded and horrified, there was nothing he could do. Instead, he admitted not only to his inability to believe the truth, but his awareness of that inability. And I think it's that the awareness of the inability is what I was describing in the beginning that motivated me to write this book in the first place. So-called climate change deniers reject the conclusion that 97% is the number you hear tossed around of climate scientists have reached, which is that the Earth is warming because of human activity. But what about the rest of us? Those of us who aren't climate deniers? We know what the scientists are saying is true, but that's not the same thing as saying that we believe what the scientists are telling us. Mm-hmm. Because if we did believe it, we would our lives would be shaken in a way that they're not now, and we would find it not only far easier, it would go without saying that we would make the small changes, the relatively small changes in our lives that are necessary in order to avoid cataclysmic ones in the future.
So if I get it right, knowing is more about the facts, but believing triggers an emotional reaction that could lead to action? Is that
well, I think knowing is an intellectual acknowledgement, and believing is when that acknowledgement moves from your brain into your heart. When we are shaken. It's something we've witnessed with coronavirus. It's interesting why it is that we've had the responses that we've had to something that, at the very least in the spring, and probably it's still true, we know far less about than we know about climate change. And as tragic as the stakes are with coronavirus, they're dwarfed by the stakes of climate change. Cities, states, and nations shut down their economies. Families quarantined, schools closed. Why? Why is it that we were able to do that when we're unable to take such relatively small actions in response to climate change? I would actually ask you what your explanation for that is.
The coronavirus one?
People so ready to make changes in their lives. Why are governments so ready to make dramatic changes in response to coronavirus when seemingly no one is willing to lift a finger when it comes to climate change?
Yeah, and I had another question related to this, which is about evidence, because, and it's a personal one because my field, agroecology, has been growing a lot. It's being viewed as an approach that can really help us attain those more sustainable food systems we want. But there is a bit of a crisis of belief. So being someone who works on this, I'm being asked to engage in creating the evidence base for agroecology. But for some of us that have been working on it for decades, for the farmers that do it, for the indigenous people that embrace it, and the social movements, there's a lot of evidence already there. Yet a lot, and these are mostly global actors, are asking for more. So the other question I had about evidence related to this is how important it is, do you think, the scientific evidence for the general public to believe? So that's one question, and maybe you can choose which one you answer, because one that I have a lot of curiosity about is, from the feedback you have received, do you think that your book has helped people move from knowing to believing?
Well, it's very, very hard to say because I only meet, it's, not as a rule, but almost as a rule, the people I meet are the people who show up. And the people who show up tend to be people who are already responsive to, already caring about this cause. Very few people go to a book reading to tell you that they hate their book, that they hate your book, and don't care about what you're saying. So I don't have an accurate impression of what most people think. Thank God, by the way. Also, it's the case that it's actually very easy to move somebody, and it's very hard to move them in a way that's sustainable. Mark Twain said that quitting smoking is one of the easiest things in the world to do. I've done it 38 times. I would say the same thing about caring about the environment. I would say the same thing about changing how one eats. I have become a vegetarian at least 24 times in my life. It's very, very easy to change an identity in a way that is aspirational because it feels good. It's hard to sustain it because it does involve compromise and sacrifice and not having what you want at every given moment. So, the last reading actually that I did in person was about 6 months ago, something like that, 7 months ago. The notion of a month has kind of lost all meaning in my life, but I think it was about then. And I was in London, and the final question that I was asked at that final reading was by a young woman, really young, like 8 or 7. And her mom kind of like held her hand up in the air, and she was very shy and embarrassed. But she said, "Do you think we will solve the climate crisis in time?" And I said, "I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I certainly don't know as a fact, and I don't even know what my opinion is." And I said, "Do you think we will?" And she said, "I also don't know." And I asked her what she thought would be necessary in order to solve the crisis in time. And she thought about it, and she said, "I think we would need to talk about it all the time." And that to me is one of the wisest prescriptions I've heard in terms of how we're going to grapple with this problem. We need to just talk about it all the time. We need to talk about it in contexts like this, people from quite different fields and walks of life. We need to talk about it in front of large audiences. We need to talk about it around our dinner tables. And we need to talk about it in eclectic ways, not only as scientists and not only as writers, but with risking embarrassment, with humility, with rigor, with honesty. So I don't believe in solutions that will happen as events, or not on the individual level. We could certainly have solutions that happen as events on the level of systems, on the level of legislation, and on the level of corporate practices, and we need those. We cannot solve this problem as individuals, but we also can't solve it without changing as individuals. And as with giving up smoking and as with changing eating habits, I think it's going to be a process, and I think it's good to acknowledge that from the beginning, because we can set ourselves up for success or we can set ourselves up for failure. Specific to eating, I meet people all the time, who say to me, "Read your book, I became a vegetarian right when I, turned the final page, and it's been 3 weeks and it's going great." And, there was a time when I thought that was really cool. Now I get a kind of chill up my spine. And I say to them, "That sounds terrific, but are you sure you're setting yourself up for success and not failure? Because if you make a dramatic change in your, not only your lifestyle, but your identity, and that identity is a binary. You're a vegetarian or you're not a vegetarian. The first time that that person eats meat, and they almost certainly will if they're like me and if they're like everybody else, they will have failed in their identity. They're no longer a vegetarian. That's why you meet, you've probably met many people who say, I was a vegetarian for 6 years. I was a vegetarian for 3 months. For a certain amount of time, and they say, what happened? I was at a barbecue. I was at a birthday party. I was at a fancy restaurant. And then it's over because vegetarian is a binary identity. If instead that person said, hey, I've been giving a lot of thought to what you shared about the relationship between animal agriculture and the environment, and I decided that I want to eat as little meat as possible, hoping then the amount is zero or whatever the decision is. After 3 weeks, it's been going pretty well. If that person then eats a burger for their, let's say, 61st meal, whatever it is, if you're batting 60 out of 61, that gets you in the Hall of Fame. That's a remarkable success, even if it would be a failure of identity. So I don't want my book to encourage shifts in identity, but rather to encourage a kind of awareness of our roles in these cause and effect chains. An awareness, first of all, that we're even making choices, because so many of our choices feel like inevitabilities. We eat what we do today because it's what we ate yesterday, because it's what's available, because it's what our expectation of a meal is, not realizing all of the options in front of us, and not realizing that so many of our choices are actually radical and new. They're not what people have been doing since the beginning of time. They're not what our grandparents did. And the food is being brought to us by processes that don't have anything to do with what farming looked like 50 years ago. So acknowledging that there's a choice to be made and acknowledging the impact of that choice, not in the interest of achieving some kind of perfection, but in the interest of participating, and participating in the repair of a world, which is not a democratic or Republican value. It's not an old or young or urban or rural value. These are just universal human values that we're talking about.
I really appreciate you bringing up identity, because I think it's a hard thing to think about, that is important to a lot of us. So it really takes reflection. And I saw this call for reflection throughout your book. We're going to get to that in a minute. I'm going to transition into ecological animal agriculture. And as you know, and I saw in one of your interviews previous to this one that a similar question was asked, but here in Vermont and at the University of Vermont, a lot of people are working to attain more sustainable animal production systems. My choice, which I made several years ago, which is somewhat similar to what you propose in the book, was not to give up meat in a meal, but just to avoid industrial meat, which I can do because I live in Vermont. So a lot of it is when I'm in Vermont, I can do it. When I'm not in Vermont, I try to avoid it because I never know where it's coming from. We have an amazing grazing team in UVM Extension, and they focus on rotational grazing and other ecologically based alternatives. And I have a partnership with my group with a farm called Bread and Butter Farm that integrates a very deep ecological practice and also humanity into the management of their herds. And they have pigs and beef and other cows. So I wanted to ask you more about, in your book, you do signal that factory farms are the problem, and that it is this type of agriculture producing a lot, which is then consumed a lot, that is the issue. But not a lot of detail about the role of this other type of agriculture. And maybe more specifically, how can we support these kinds of farmers? My background in ecology and agronomy, and now I'm doing more social science work and justice work, but a lot of ecologists believe that in certain ecosystems, having animals is good ecologically. So tell us more about how important do you think it is to support these kinds of systems, and maybe what is the best way to support them?
Well, undeniably, having animals is good in certain ecosystems, and not only good, but necessary in certain ecosystems. And undeniably, there are people on our planet who don't have access to other kinds of nutrition, who don't have access to other kinds of agriculture. The most comprehensive analysis of the relationship between animal agriculture and climate change was published at the end of 2018. And the authors studied food systems all over the planet and made a point of saying that in such places that I just described, people could afford to eat actually more, a little bit more meat and a little bit more dairy. But citizens of Europe and the United States need to reduce their consumption of animal products, of meat by about 90% and dairy by about 60% in order to avoid what they called irreversible climate collapse. So I would be very happy to advocate for the kind of farming that you're describing, which is a real thing, and I visited those farms. They're farms that take sustainability as seriously, more seriously than just about anybody else, and they take animal welfare very seriously, and they take the treatment of farmers very seriously. You say I didn't give them that much space in the book. In large part, that's because they don't occupy very much space in our system. More than 99.9% of the animals that we eat in America are raised on factory farms. It is true that there are what I would describe as noble farmers in our country, and you have a grossly disproportionate number of them in Vermont. It's also true that as a real number, not per capita, but as a real number, we have fewer farmers in America now than we had during the Civil War, even though our population has doubled 11 times. So I think one way actually to champion and be respectful of the good farmers is to acknowledge how endangered they and their practices are. When you said you're not in Vermont, you don't always know where your meat would come from. You actually do know where your meat comes from. It comes from factory farms. So it can be, I think, dangerous to speak about the exceptions without being honest about how exceptional they are and the challenges of reforming a system that is so dominant and so powerful. When I published my first nonfiction book, Eating Animals, which is not exactly, but it's awfully close to being a case for vegetarianism. It's really a case against factory farming. I thought that the animal rights community would be the strongest advocates of the book, and farmers would be picketing outside of readings that I gave. In fact, it was exactly the opposite. Small traditional farmers hate factory farming more than any other group that I've ever engaged with, and recognize the environmental destruction that industry is creating, and also recognize that whatever solution we have, however we transition to other kinds of eating and other kinds of agriculture, we have to eat less meat. We live on a planet of 7 going on 8 billion people. The earth is not growing. Animal agriculture requires a lot of resources. It takes between 6 and 26 calories put into an animal to get 1 calorie back out. There are ways to mitigate the amounts of methane, and this is something that you probably know a lot more about than I do, and I would be happy to ask you about this rather than try to answer it myself. But methane and nitrous oxide are 2 of the most powerful greenhouse gases. They're 86 and 310 times as powerful as carbon. Animal agriculture is the leading emitter of both. There are ways to mitigate the amount of methane that a cow produces, but a cow is a cow. And to my knowledge, and please do correct me if I'm wrong about this, any kind of dairy or beef farming is going to be a larger emitter of methane as our population expands and as our globe doesn't expand. And we are contemplating the best ways, the most efficient and rapid ways to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. it seems like an awfully good place to start. It's not a coincidence that Al Gore and Greta Thunberg and virtually every climate scientist that I've been in conversation with is either a vegetarian or takes seriously in their own lives and in their prescriptions for others the idea that we just need to eat less of this.
Absolutely. No, I really like that approach, and I wanted to give it a shout out to the Vermont farmers that are doing the right thing. So I'm going to transition to reflection. I called this section reflection, action, and maybe motivation. And this was a section that I really enjoyed coming up with the questions, because in our group, the Agroecology and Livelihoods Collaborative, we use an approach that is called Participatory Action Research, PAR, which simply described as just doing research with people for people. But it has three main activities that in a process, they're usually longer term research processes. You have research, reflection, and then action. And the scientists are perhaps more interested in the research, and the farmers are usually our partners, are more interested in the action most of the time. And a lot of the times we both struggle with reflection, right? But the reflection is perhaps the most important one, because it's when you take the information that you've collected in partnership, and then you decide what to do. It might be to gather more data, or it might be that the farmers say, this is enough and it can help me solve a problem right now. And she can just go and apply it, and we keep working together. But throughout your book, and especially in your chapter, it might have been one of my favorites, Dispute with the Soul, you present a dialogue between yourself and your soul. And at the core, I felt that it was a series of reflections in which your soul is trying to guide you to action. You have this conversation about the difficulties that you're facing to understand things better in terms of what to do, and your soul is just sort of like guiding you through it in order to help you get to the act. Did I get it right? Is that what's happening in that chapter? And if not, please tell us a little bit more about it.
Well, it's funny that I should have written that in that way, because I don't think I believe in a soul, or at least not in the way that most people talk about it. What I do believe is that there are different parts of me, and they are in conversation with each other. Ideally, they're in conversation with each other, rather than just the more powerful or the more immediate repressing the more reflective. There's a part of me, I assume it's the same for you, that knows what the right thing to do is. And I don't mean that in the sense of because I was instructed to think that way or feel that way by anybody else, but because of my own process of digesting what I have learned about the world. And so this part of me is very much responsive to information. To return to something you were talking about earlier, there is a baseline of information that we need. It's why Karski was so smart to accumulate the testimonies and the evidence, and it's why we are in such debt to climate scientists. If we had not been presented with the information that lets us know the impact of our choices, then we couldn't be held accountable for making bad choices. They couldn't even really be described as bad choices. So there is a part of me that digests the information that I learn about how the world actually works and makes decisions about what is right. And it's kind of like an old-fashioned word, right? And it's one that somebody like me feels a little bit of discomfort when contemplating. My instinct is to become just a little bit ironic or a little bit cynical. I imagine students who are watching this have a similar reflex, and yet I really believe that each of us has something inside of us that feels discomfort when when it's not allowed to guide the choices that we make. So I call that the soul for the both because I was referring to a historical document that refers to it as a soul in the book,
Yeah.
and also because it's useful shorthand, for that part of us. So as I said, there are different parts that are in conversation. I have a soul. I also have a hedonistic side. I don't know what other vegetarians are like. I should say that I'm a vegetarian, by the way. I don't even know if we said that yet. But I am the kind of vegetarian who really likes meat, who really likes the way it tastes, and I really like its smell, and I've really loved the functions that it served in my life. Psychologically, communally. My grandmother, who we spoke about earlier, cooking was her primary way of conveying love. And that cooking included meat, almost always. So there is a part of me that, because of what I know about the impacts on the environment, because of what I know about how animals are treated, because of what I know about how factory farms have become breeding grounds for pandemics, something we might get a chance to talk about, because of what I know about what the factory farming industry has done to rural communities and done to farmers, says this is very clear. This isn't ambiguous. This isn't. I don't want to be a part of that. But there are other parts of me that, because of convenience, maybe because of a kind of ethical laziness, but also for what I would say are very good reasons, like the value of food. Whether it's pleasure, or it has something to do with love, interpersonal relationships. There's another part of me that says it's not that simple. And those parts of me are in conversation, and sometimes that conversation is a debate. And I wanted that to try to give expression, give words to that debate.
I thought it was brilliant. I thought that, and again, for our students that are watching this all over the world, hopefully, I think reflection for me has become so important to our work. And that is a feeling that I take from your book, a very strong feeling of a call for more reflection, for deeper reflection with yourself and about what you know and how that can be, how can you believe based on reflecting and having these conversations with yourself, which can be hard, but not impossible. I can't
bring you to where you need to be. It's asking not only a lot. I think it's asking too much of us to reflect every time we look at a menu in a restaurant, to reflect every time we're opening the fridge and deciding what to cook. Sometimes we will rise to the occasion. Sometimes we will have a memory of the information that the climate scientists have taught us. Sometimes we will have a very strong feeling about what it is that's right to do and how our very local decision will affect our global values. I think we're going to lose, to be really brutally honest. I think we're going to lose if we're depending on that kind of reflection. So how can we short circuit to some extent reflection? So an analogy that I think of all the time is shoplifting. If you go to a store and you see something that you like, that you want, what is your, can you tell me, I'm literally asking you now, can you tell me what your process of reflection is like that leads you not to steal?
I don't know if I can tell you. It happens, but
So I think
it's wrong, right? Like stealing
most people would say, I don't even think about it. There is no process of reflection. It doesn't require me to have a memory of the social contract. It doesn't require me to have a feeling about the shopkeeper and how I don't want to take money from his or her pocket. Most people would say, I just don't shoplift. I don't do it because I don't do it. It is my norm. It is how I have shaped my life. We need to somehow shape ourselves so that we don't steal from the planet and we don't steal from the future. And we need, if anything, it would be great if we could dispose of the reflection. And I think the best way to do that is to have rules in our lives and to have plans. I had a very, like a transformative experience. I did a reading, and at the end there was a book signing, and about halfway into the line was a young couple. Let's say they were in their early 20s, and they came to the front of the line, and they opened their book in front of me to the page that is normally blank, that I would sign, but it was filled with their handwriting. And I said, "Well, what is this?" And they said, "We're going to get married at the end of the summer, and we decided when we were listening to you that we need to have a plan for what our life is going to be like together, because otherwise it will just be as it was." Because that's generally how it works with people. You do today what you did yesterday. The plan that they wrote was eat vegetarian unless served meat at a friend's house, eat vegan 2 days a week, don't own a car, and have no more than 2 children. And then instead of just having me sign it, they had a line at the bottom that said witness, and they wanted me to sign that. And I thought it was really funny and charming, and I loved seeing how they navigated their own conflicting inner voices, you know, the part of them that says we have to eat less meat, with the part of them that says, yeah, but if we're going to a friend's house, we don't feel comfortable not eating what's served to us, what they spent their time and money to provide for us. I loved witnessing that, and I found it charming, and I chuckled. And then as I was walking back to my hotel, I started to feel really bad, and I couldn't figure out why. And I realized it was because I didn't have a plan myself. You know, I had written the book. I was the guy who did the reading. I was the guy on the stage, the guy who signed their book. And yet they were so far ahead of me in terms of figuring out how to live in this moment. And I went home and I started to write out a plan, which I then shared with people that I knew, with my kids. I taped it up on a wall, and it really changed my life. Before I wrote a plan, I thought, and I was very happy to say out loud to anybody who would listen, I'm going to fly less in 2020. Little did I realize how easy that would be. I'm going to fly less. The truth is, it was a completely empty statement. It lacked meaning, because I know what would have happened. Summer break comes around, and hey, what should we do? Well, we don't get that much time off, and it would be really wonderful to go somewhere with a different climate and to be great. Not only is it pleasurable, it feels right. It feels moral to have your sense of how things are done expanded, to realize that, you know, your way of doing things is so slim compared to what's available. And I probably would have like booked airplane tickets. I wrote a plan out that night in my hotel room that said I'm not going to fly for vacations in 2020. Because of that, because I had my values or my instincts codified, you know, into a statement that has dates, numbers, names, then when summer break rolls around, I just won't even consider it, in the same way that I wouldn't even consider shoplifting, because this is who I am. So I would very, very strongly encourage everybody watching this who doesn't have a plan, and my guess is most people don't, because most people don't. It never even occurred to me, as I said, until I met this young couple, to just write it down. You know, we know that there are 4 activities that matter more than all others when it comes to an individual's relationship to climate change, which are flying, driving, overpopulation, like controlling overpopulation, and eating. So I think it's a really productive, generative experience to sit down as an individual, to sit down with your partner or your family or your friends and say, what can we do about flying? And to say we're going to do it less is not to say anything. How much less? How are we going to distinguish between vacations and business trips? How do we think about eating? How do we think about our automobile use? And to write them down in statements and tape them to something and let people witness it, talk about it, that has changed my life. And it is the way to get around this problem that we've been talking about, which is believing.
And paralysis.
Yeah.
I have a colleague that likes checklists. He's gonna be happy that you said that. Let's write a plan. Let's write our
Your
checklist.
checklist. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna shift this a little bit because justice is, as I said before, is really important to me. And in your book, you mentioned how the people most affected by climate change in the global south are actually the ones that have the least responsibility in creating it. So what actions do you think we can take to support these people and aspire for more climate justice? Because right now we are not doing a lot to support the impacts in the global south. And also here, right, in the United States, we're facing it too. So it actually applies now a lot more to the US as it has applied to the global south. So what can you tell us about climate justice?
Well, as you said, locally and globally, the people who suffer most from climate change and the people who will suffer most from climate change are those who are least responsible for it. So the responsibility to change is not equal, just as the ability to change is not equal. It's a good moment actually to try to dismantle one of the most common counter-arguments to the idea that we should eat differently, to adjust our eating in the interest of the planet, which is that it's elitist to talk about. It's frankly the only counter-argument that I ever hear. When you mentioned the existence of regenerative farms, that's not, to my mind, a counter-argument. That's part of my argument. That's part of the change that I'm envisioning, is the expansion of that kind of farming. As I said, the only argument that you ever hear is, well, it's elitist. This is like a white man talking about what everybody else needs to do. In fact, it's really the opposite of the truth. People who make less than $35,000 a year are 3.5 times as likely to be vegetarian as people who make more than $75,000 a year. People of color are disproportionately vegetarian. Harvard Medical School did a study in 2019 and found that it's $750 a year less expensive to be a vegetarian than to be a meat eater. And the argument for human health is not controversial. So we need to participate, and people who are most able to participate have the greatest responsibility to participate, which is why, as I referenced that article in Nature magazine, where the authors said that there are certainly people on the planet who depend on animal agriculture, and it would be unreasonable and unethical to ask them to change. It's people like us and people like those watching this for whom the next meal is a choice, that are most responsible to make the change and need to make the most dramatic changes in our lives. But we also need to approach it with some humility. We are different and we need to respect our differences. I find it relatively easy not to eat meat. It's not effortless, but I find it relatively easy. I find the idea of never getting on a plane again unimaginable. Whether it is or isn't, it feels like it's required for my job, and it feels like such an important part of my family life that I can't imagine it. There are plenty of people in this country who never get on planes and find it utterly impossible to imagine eating less meat. I can bring myself to understanding their perspective and respecting it. I hope that they can bring themselves to understanding and respecting my perspective. We need to have rigorous conversations with ourselves about what our own limits are. When we make those lists, they're going to look different. They're not going to be identical. The couple that I met, what I found so actually inspiring about their approach was how different it was from what my own approach would be. And when I hear about somebody's ethical accomplishments, I tend to find those people very annoying. And there's something unfortunate in me that reflexively wants to almost like offset their good doing by, doing bad. When I hear somebody say, I bought a Prius and I'm never getting on a plane again, my instinct is, well, I'm going to buy an SUV and fly around the world for no reason at all. But when I hear about somebody's struggle, when somebody says to me, I really want to try to do this thing because it matters to me and is in keeping with my values, but I'm finding it so difficult because I love sushi too much, because I love winter vacations too much, because I love my kids too much, and I don't want to live in a world in which I can't have more than one child. I really get that, and I respect that, and it inspires me to want to grapple with my own inconsistencies and my own hypocrisies. I find sharing the struggle to be the most generative kind of conversation, the most generative beginning of a conversation.
I fully agree. It seems that I've been doing a lot of presentations this month and in panels, and what keeps coming up is the need for dialogue from different people. So for us in agroecology, we work a lot with farmers, is how do we have better dialogues with farmers? How do we have better dialogues with policymakers that can support some of the type of farming that we're advocating for? And I hear you saying the same. I'm going to have to transition us to some questions from the audience because we really wanted to get you to engage with the audience. And I have a first question from Ginny. And she says, you touched on the 4 ways to combat climate change in your book, and which you just mentioned right now. Why is no one talking about population control? The actions of people are what causes climate change. And I guess you are, but I think what I get from her is that it's a bit of a taboo issue that not everyone talks about.
Yeah, so I mean, they're all slightly taboo issues. It's such a shame that we can't solve global warming by eating less cauliflower. We really would have done that already. But the things that we are asked to do less of are things that most people value, and value for good reason. Population control is like the third rail. She's absolutely right. It's the thing that's most difficult to talk about. And we need to talk about it because we have no hope if we don't control overpopulation. And it is the single most important choice that each of us makes when confronting the environment. It doesn't take up a lot of space in my book. I feel like I was fairly honest about it, but it doesn't take up a lot of space in my book because it's not really the kind of book I was writing. I was writing a book about daily choices. I actually had college and high school students in mind as the kind of audience that I was imagining as I was writing the book. And it's frankly not a choice that most people are in the process of making, whereas food is a choice that we make many times, for most people 3 or more times every day. But there is a very important and good book to be written about rethinking families, the sizes of families, the difference between choosing to have biological children and adopting children. I can't think of any issue that's more pressing than that.
Thank you. So our second question is actually from a colleague in the environmental studies program who has written herself a couple of books about climate change, Amy Seidel. And her question is, like racism in the US, many see climate change as structural and an outcome of colonization, oppression, and an economic system that values profits over social welfare. Do you agree with this statement? And secondly, how do we simultaneously address these structures as well as dietary changes you suggest to mitigate climate change?
I don't disagree. I think that the forces that brought the factory farming system into prominence and dominance are not exclusive to the factory farming system, and predate it and are far broader than it. I would be very curious. It's such a shame. It's such a shame we're not together in person, because I would love to ask Amy how she thinks about it, not only in terms of the system of factory farming, but the system of animal agriculture, which an awful lot of people, I don't know how I feel about this, to be honest, but a lot of people would group it in into those same issues, that structural issues where there are enormous power imbalances, and what happens when we scale power imbalances. And this is one of the discomforts that I sometimes feel when thinking about good farms. You know, the kinds of farms that you have more of in Vermont than are seen in America as a whole. You know, I can imagine a situation in which giving a 13-year-old a job, a full-time job, could be a good thing. I can imagine a beneficent employer. I can imagine a family that would otherwise not be able to stay together. I can imagine a child who would starve to death if not for having that paying job. That doesn't make me a proponent of child labor. Because we know that when you scale a system where there's such an imbalanced power dynamic, that dynamic is going to be abused. It's impossible to protect the safety of the person at the bad end of the power imbalance. You know, my book is a lot of thinking out loud. You had said your favorite part was that section of the conversation with the soul. This is sort of me thinking out loud. I do wonder if animal agriculture is such a power imbalance. It's not to say that there aren't and wouldn't always be really good farmers who really take care of their animals and really take care of the planet. I do wonder when we put a power imbalance into a structure, you know, a capitalist structure, when there are such incredibly powerful incentives to abuse the power imbalance, if we would ever be able to scale it in a way that's just. You don't have that power imbalance with any other kind of farming. And I don't see any way to get around it with animal farming. So I can only say that it's something that I've given a lot of thought to, and I don't yet know exactly what I think about it.
It's very complicated. I give it a lot of thought too. The other thing that I'm going to appreciate before I go to our next question from the audience is, I appreciate that you're bringing the issue of discomfort, because right now, with the racial tensions that we are addressing and trying to hopefully improve, being comfortable with discomfort is really a must. So I've appreciated you've brought that up several times, that I find discomfort, and I'm happy that people are seeing you say that openly, because I think all of us need to do a lot more of that, is to just walk into spaces of discomfort to address some of these issues that are very...
I agree, and part of that is we need to create communities that allow for a process, that allow for a thought process, that allow one to move from uncertainty or from discomfort or from simply just not knowing toward a place of greater clarity. And I worry that now, and especially on college campuses, we have an insistence on clarity. You know, you say the right thing right now, otherwise there are grave consequences. And so what you end up having is a lot of people performing clarity that they don't yet have. And it's not helpful. It's not constructive. It has to be okay to be confused, even about the most important issues. It has to be okay to need help. You know, I'll tell you a truth right now. In advance of this conversation, I was very nervous about this conversation, because I bothered to look you up, and I realized that you know a lot more than I know about a lot of the issues that I am now being brought on to pretend to be an expert of. And I was worried about having to perform an expertise that I don't actually have. And I was worried about looking foolish. If you wanted to, I feel pretty sure you could make me look foolish. You could say, well, you might not be aware of the most recent science and regenerative blah 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 blah, and you would be right. And I could probably, because I've had enough experience with this, find a rhetorical way around being painted into a corner. And I could maybe even, because I've had a lot of experience with this, find a way to turn the tables on you, and neither of us win. I mean, we see this in our political debates and discourse. It's become a zero-sum game rather than an effort to seek progress. And progress requires some amount of humility, some amount of foolishness, and a willingness to not only accept one's own confusion, but to accept other people's confusion, and see it not as weakness or worse, evil, but as productive.
You've mentioned humility a couple of times, and that is one of our principles for doing participatory action research. It is a principle of the approach. Now I'm going to move, you also mentioned politics, so I'm going to move to the next question from Veronica, which is, what do you feel about Trump's denial of climate change, and are you going to vote?
What do I feel about Trump's denial of climate change? What I feel is it puts him far, far, far outside of the mainstream. And I mean, it puts him far outside of mainstream Republican values. There are twice as many Americans who believe in the existence of Bigfoot as deny the existence of human-caused climate change. The majority of Republican voters have said they wish the United States remained in the Paris Climate Accords. That's like a very robust statement. That's not saying simply the climate is changing. It's not simply saying humans are causing the climate to change. It's saying we want our government to legislate in powerful ways to bring our practices, to have our practices reflect the science that we know. So Donald Trump is not representative of a political party, and he's certainly not representative of half of the country when he takes that stance. Am I going to vote? You're goddamn right I'm going to vote. I talked about the four most important acts that one can take, and I neglected to mention actually the most important, which is voting. We need to make the kinds of changes that I mentioned, but we can't actually save the planet only by making those changes as individuals. We need systemic change. We need legislated change. I happen to think the best way to bring about that change, when we have leaders who are not reflecting our values, is with our habits, and even, most importantly, with our money. Tesla is now the largest car manufacturer in the history of the United States. It's not because the government brought them into being, although I wish that the government would regulate the auto industry much more powerfully than they do right now, rigorously than they do right now. But Tesla was brought to the success that it has because of consumer preference. Beyond Meat was one of the most successful IPOs in the last decade of the American stock market. It's not because the government propped them up as they prop up the factory farm industry, at the expense, by the way, of the kinds of farmers that you're talking about in Vermont. It's because of individual preference. So we shouldn't either underestimate the power of our choices or underestimate we shouldn't overstate the distinction between systems and individuals. So yeah, I'm going to vote. Of course I'm going to vote. If you ask Donald Trump, I'm going to vote 100 times. But in fact, I would only vote once.
Yesterday. I have a question from Michael. What intersection, if any, do you find between your views and action in your religious or faith beliefs?
So I don't think I have any faith beliefs. In terms of my religion, I was raised Jewish, but in a family of non-believers. So it was a cultural Judaism, which included ritual, but the ritual was guiding us toward a community and toward a set of values which are in no way distinct to Jews. Values of, there's actually an expression that I used earlier without even really thinking about it, which was repairing the world. which is, there's a Jewish expression, tikkun olam, which means to repair the world. And that was an idea that I was taught in Hebrew school as a young kid, and obviously stuck with me. So I don't think that the intersection is conscious. I don't, go to Jewish texts when I want to contemplate how I should, the kinds of choices I should make vis-a-vis the environment. But it had, I'm sure, a profound influence on me, as did being a Washingtonian, being an American. There are so many different identities that are in conversation when we're making choices. Usually they're invisible to us, or the conversation is muted to us, strange as that is. But Judaism is definitely one of the louder voices in that conversation.
You do mention the Jewish faith a lot, or Jewish tradition in your book. I did notice that. So sadly, because I'm really enjoying the conversation, it is time to wrap it up. So I just wanted to thank you once again for joining us in this very warm conversation, dialogue. There's a phrase we use in agroecology in Spanish, diálogo de saberes, or a dialogue of knowledges. And keep up with the great, important work. I have your fiction books on my list. I'm an avid fiction reader, so I'm going to look them up next.
Well, I appreciate it, and I have a number of your articles on my, actually on the window, I don't even know how you describe it on a two-dimensional screen, but behind the window on which we're presently talking, I have a bunch of your articles queued up and ready to read, so we can learn from each other.
That sounds great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.